Today, we're continuing our series on the Zaporozhye Automobile Plant. You've already seen two videos on the iconic Zaporozhets, and now it's time to talk about its successor, the Tavria. This car was a game changer for the plant. Gone were the days of rear-engine, air-cooled quirks. Tavria was modern, front-wheel drive, liquid-cooled, and dressed in a stylish hatchback body that felt fresh and forward-looking. It was meant to reinvent Zaz's image, and in many ways, it did. But there was a catch. It took 22 years to finally reach the production line. And by the time it did in 1987, the spotlight had already shifted, with the more refined, prestigious Lada Samara stealing most of the attention. So buckle up, because today we're diving into the story of the Tavria, a car full of ambition, delays, and a legacy that's more complex than it seems. The story of the Tavria doesn't start in the 80s. It actually begins all the way back in 1965. At the time, Zaporozhet's cars were rear-engined, and that made sense. It was a practical layout for the mid-20th century and suited both the factory's capabilities and the needs of Soviet drivers. But by the mid-60s, the engineers at the Zaporozhye plant were looking ahead. And when they looked west, they saw the future, front-wheel drive. Back then, FWD wasn't a clear winner yet. It brought strange handling, new parts like CV joints, and an overall unfamiliar driving experience. It needed testing, real testing. And that's when Zaz and the engineers at NAMI came up with something wild. A twin-engine prototype built on the base of the Zaz 966. The rear engine stayed where it was, but another identical one was installed in the front trunk, driving the front wheels. No blueprints, no photos survived, unfortunately. But here's what we know. Engineers could switch between front and rear engines at will. Same engine, different drivetrain. That allowed them to directly compare acceleration, handling, traction, and more. They even had fun with it. Chief designer Vladimir Stashenko recalled how, with both engines running, they could easily outrun more powerful cars on the highway, all while driving what looked like an ordinary little Zaporozhets. Imagine the faces of those other drivers. These twin-engine testers did their job well. Zaz engineers became convinced the future was in front-wheel drive, and they were ready to build it. It's important to remember the context. Zaporozhet's cars had a reputation, cheap, bare bones, laughed at even within the USSR. But inside the plant were talented engineers, trapped inside the limits of a dated design. And they dreamed of breaking out, of building something bold, modern, and worthy of respect. That dream started to take shape in 1970 with the first front-wheel drive prototype. Another followed in 1972. In 1973, they tested one with a sedan body. 1974, 1975, each of these early cars was made in tiny numbers. It's important to understand that all those front-wheel drive prototypes we mentioned earlier were built purely on the passion and initiative of Zaz engineers. The official green light for development came only in 1978. That same year, the first real prototype of what would become the Tavria was shown, a hatchback. Admittedly, it wasn't a design masterpiece, but it didn't look out of place next to Western cars of the time either. The prototype even caught the attention of General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, a well-known car enthusiast. He liked the little Zaporozhian, and for a brief moment, it seemed like production might start soon. But then, Soviet bureaucracy stepped in. The USSR is often accused of copying Western cars, and there's some truth to that. But what's often forgotten is that many of those copies were forced upon engineers against their will. This case was no exception. Despite Zaz having years of experience with front-wheel drive, the ministry issued an order. The new model must be based on a foreign design. The first donor? The Ford Fiesta. It was tested at the plant, and honestly, didn't show anything spectacular. But the directive stood: copy it. No questions asked. Ironically, when comparing the looks, the Zaz hatchback arguably came out on top. Later, more donor cars were sent. The Fiat Uno, the Volkswagen Polo, and every time engineers had to start from scratch, again and again. Whispers began to circulate, and they haven't gone away, that this wasn't just bureaucratic chaos. It was deliberate. At the same time, Lada was working on its own front-wheel drive project, the future Lada Samara. Massive resources were being funneled into it, and the Soviet leadership wanted Samara to be the national modern car. The Zaz hatchback? It was seen as a threat, and it had to be slowed down. And so, after an unthinkable 22 years since the first front-wheel drive tests, and 17 years after the appearance of the first prototype, in 1987, the Tavria finally reached mass production. Of course, there was no sensation, especially against the backdrop of the Lada Samara, which appeared 3 years earlier in 1984. But still, it was a big step forward. The Tavria no longer provoked mockery like its predecessors. Simple, yes, but it was a real car, modern in spirit, even if not in technology. Yes, by the time of its debut, many of its technologies were already outdated. Yes, the design had plenty of flaws, but overall, it turned out not bad. The Tavria went on sale in 1988. A significant delay in launching the car meant that it was only distributed across the USSR from 1988 to 1991. This time was catastrophically short to eliminate all the childhood diseases of the new model. And then the collapse of the USSR happened. Economic crisis, empty budgets, no opportunity for modernization. The factory just kept producing what it already had. At the same time, a stream of used foreign cars poured into the market, and they outperformed the Tavria in almost every way, except perhaps fuel consumption. Thus, the invisible intrigues of the 1970s, sabotage, and the system's slowness planted a time bomb that exploded at the worst possible moment. The saddest part of this story is the engineers, especially the chief designer Vladimir Stashenko, who quite literally lived for this car. He rushed around the workshops, was constantly nervous, refused to take a vacation, and when they finally persuaded him to rest, it was already too late. In 1991, he passed away. His heart couldn't take it. With his death, not just a chapter ended, but the hope for a second wind for the Tavria. Promising projects remained on paper, and the refinement of the base model came to a halt. The factory didn't make it, didn't manage, didn't live to see the time when things could have been different. Nevertheless, production continued, and there was demand. Why? Because price mattered. The Tavria cost almost twice less than a Lada. Those who could afford it bought a Samara. The rest settled for a Tavria. Its engine was produced in Melitopol. First, a modest 1.1, then 1.2, and finally 1.3 liters with fuel injection. And this 750-kilogram pill could surprise you, sometimes launching off the line like a hot pepper. After Ukraine gained independence, Tavria production didn't stop. The car continued to roll off the line, largely unchanged, all the way until 1998. There were some attempts at modernization, and a few were even successful. For example, in 1993, engineers developed a station wagon version called Dana, which went into production in 1994. It was more practical than the original three-door hatchback, and had a better layout overall. Still, it never caught on and was quietly discontinued by 1997. Naturally, the factory also started looking into commercial vehicles. Some ideas remained one-offs, others saw limited production. In fact, Zaz had been experimenting with this concept as early as 1990. Around the same time, they even tried launching a convertible Tavria, though it flopped and only a few dozen were ever made. But perhaps the most curious prototype was the asymmetric Tavria. Yes, the one you see in the photo. It had 2 doors on the right and only one on the left. Sound familiar? That's the same layout used by the Hyundai Veloster, only this was years earlier. A strange idea, but quite clever. Tavrias were also exported abroad. The most interesting case was the French adaptation of the car for the local market. There were also attempts to introduce it in the UK, but the primary export destinations were Latin America and the Middle East. One project that truly deserves mention is the rally version of the Tavria, built in the early 1990s by enthusiasts in Estonia. It had a tubular frame chassis, a widened wheelbase, and extra air ducts for engine cooling. And instead of the modest Melitopol engine, they dropped in a tuned Lada 2106, producing 140 horsepower. Unfortunately, this beast never made it to the big leagues. It wasn't approved for Soviet-wide rally competitions. A shame, really. It had serious potential. In 1998, the Zaporozhye Automobile Plant entered a new era. Cooperation with South Korea's Daewoo began, and on the wave of these changes, the good old Tavria received a large-scale update. According to the factory, there were over 300 upgrades. But what stood out the most were the new paint coatings. The bodies were finally painted in the trendy metallic shades of that time, and the anti-corrosion treatment was improved. The car's appearance became more lively and modern. Of course, there were skeptics, but overall, the updates were warmly received. Sales jumped sharply, and Tavria literally got a second life. Fuel-injected engines appeared, the interior trim changed, and the car began to be taken more seriously. In 1999, another version rolled off the conveyor belt and quickly became as much of a bestseller as the Tavria itself. This was the 5-door liftback Slavuta. Its story began back in 1995 as a sedan project based on the Tavria. But in the end, a liftback was born, practical, roomy, and, importantly, slightly more solid. Tavria and Slavuta were produced in parallel. The first remained simpler, unpainted bumpers, basic configuration. The second looked a bit more prestigious and cost more. I, the author of this channel, was born and raised in Zaporozhye. Everything I'm talking about literally happened before my eyes. And I can say for sure, in the early 2000s, both the Tavria and especially the Slavuta looked respectable. If earlier people joked, half an hour of shame and you're at work, referring to the Zaporozhets, then the Tavria was perceived seriously as a regular, full-fledged car. The classic Tavria remained on the production line until 2009, and the Slavuta until 2011. There were persistent rumors that they were discontinued, not because of lack of demand. It was there, especially in the regions. Many people, instead of a 15-year-old used BMW, preferred a new, albeit simple, car, one whose seats no one had yet sat in. But the reason for stopping production was environmental standards. The engines no longer met modern requirements. And so ended the story of the original cars, of the Zaporozhye Automobile Plant. Everything produced afterward was no longer their own design,